Thank you for tuning in today. I'm John McConnell, and I'm the director of the Center for Health Systems Effectiveness at Oregon Health and Science University. And I want to take a quick moment to recognize the rest of the Mike Planning Committee for their continued work in planning these events. That includes Sarah Gordon, who's an assistant professor at Boston University School of Public Health and co-directs the BU Medicaid Policy Lab. Jamila Michener is the co-director of the Cornell Center for Health and Equity and co-director of the Politics of Race, Immigration, Class, and Ethnicity Initiative, and also board chair of the Cornell Prison Education Program at Cornell University. And Will Shapiro is an assistant professor in the Division of Health Policy and Economics of the Department of Population Health Sciences at the Joan and Sanford Weill Medical College of Cornell University. And with that, I have the pleasure of introducing our featured speaker, Kate McEvoy. And Kate is the executive director of the National Association of Medicaid Directors. So before taking the lead role at NAMD, Kate led the Milbank Memorial Fund's work in support of the state executive branch staff and policymakers, as well as its policy initiatives on healthy aging. She was also the director of health services for Connecticut's Department of Social Services, where she led the Medicaid program as well as the implementation of the Affordable Care Act. And I'm just so pleased to have a voice from NAMD. If you're not familiar with National Association of Medicaid Directors, it's a professional committee of the Medicaid directors who oversee Medicaid and CHIP programs for each of the 50 states, as well as the District of Columbia and U.S. territories. And Kate might not like this framing, but my sense is if you wanted to find the one person who could distill the priorities of Medicaid programs into a single 40-minute talk, which is maybe an impossible task, that Kate would be the person to do it. I've been in conversation with Kate before, and she's really interested in creating a stronger link between NAMD and researchers. And so even though she's incredibly busy, she was eager to have a chance to talk to this audience. So I'm really excited that you all have a chance to hear from her. She's going to bring us an update from the policy world, where Medicaid leaders are coming out of a period of unprecedented demands and change, and she's going to describe what that looks like from her perspective. So for her insights, please join me in welcoming Kate. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. And John, thank you so very much for that extremely kind introduction. I want to thank John and the fellow Mike conveners for this tremendous honor. I've been looking forward to this so tremendously because genuinely, I do hope that this is not just a situational connection, that we do think about ways to engender kind of perennial connections between researchers and Medicaid directors. So I hope we'll leap off of that in the discussion and ongoing. As John said, I am incredibly privileged to represent the Medicaid directors in the 56 territories and states in which the program is implemented on a day-to-day basis. I have the challenge and the inspiration today to distill, as John said, distill kind of present realities and priorities for the programs. It is a tall order because there is a significant array of presenting issues and concerns, and I'm going to do my best to kind of capsule that. Like I said, we'll be very inspired and interested in where this leads us in discussion. So as I was starting to say, just saying a bit more about our association, we represent directors. We look to amplify and really bring public recognition and awareness to the myriad initiatives that are being advanced on a state-by-state basis. We're actually also very much focused on acting as liaisons between the folks who are operating the program on a day-to-day basis and the federal oversight agencies. Of course, notably the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, but increasingly because of the broad portfolio of Medicaid innovation work that is spanning a broader swath of those federal partners. So I'll say more about that. We are led, as you may be aware, by a 14-person board of directors that represent Medicaid programs, large and small, red and blue across the country, and they are the bellwether of their peers. So I'm really privileged to work on a day-to-day basis with them. It is very well known to all of us. Medicaid is incredibly significant in our sometimes fractured continuum of healthcare coverage options. As of October, which is the latest benchmark month for public reporting of this data by the federal government, Medicaid was serving more than 1 in 5 Americans. I will immediately say that we are coming off a period where we reached apex enrollment historically, and it was closer to 1 in for Americans. So we're all aware of the magnitude of the penetration of the program and its impact, not only on the health security and the supports for people's health needs, but also its relationship to peace of mind and economic security, observing developmental readiness for children, engagement, work retention, and over the course of an individual's lifetime, their earnings, as well as engagement and autonomy for older adults and people with disabilities. So very profound influence and impacts. You know a lot about what this slide says already, so I won't dwell entirely here, but really unpacking that overall census data. It is the program that is serving mothers in giving birth in our country. This figure of 4 in 10 births belies the fact that in many urban settings and distressed municipalities, Medicaid is in fact serving more like 70 or 80% of births. And the predominant population served by the program, of course, is children. And children are rising in level of importance in terms of priority for the program, particularly in areas such as behavioral health. And I will certainly talk about that in context of where we are coming out of the pandemic. Finally, it's the mainstay of services and supports for older adults and people with disabilities. Despite public misconception about the primacy of Medicare, obviously Medicaid is the seat of this coverage. Interestingly, I think we've seen an enormously positive phenomenon over the last 5 years, and that is increasing not only public awareness, but that positive regard in which the program is held. And this Kaiser Family Foundation Health Tracking Poll is an important indicator kind of longitudinally of where we're situated. I think belying some assumptions people may be making, 76% of folks across the ideological continuum had a favorable view of the program. So again, it is for all kinds of good reasons, much more kind of prevalent in people's understanding and situational awareness because of that nexus to people all across the age continuum and in families, but also obviously the marquee status of Medicaid coming out of the pandemic that is associated with unwinding. You're very well familiar with the premise of the program, but I think it's worth remarking on this at the top of this presentation, and that is that since its inception and through the iterations of development and growth and expansion that have occurred over time, the foundational aspect of Medicaid in the federal law is that it is an equity and programmatic partnership between the federal government and states and territories, kind of on a more tertiary level between states and territories and their members, providers, contractors, and advocates. And I think that's something that we have a very keen focus on right now, the sort of breadth of the opportunities that have already been initiated and those that are substantially untapped in terms of partnerships. The reason that I include this material here is really to remind us all that there is a floor of protections that is mandated under the federal law, and that spans these domains that we often look at in terms of eligibility, mandated benefits, and kind of overall undergirding of the federal financing for the program. But there is retained at the state level substantial autonomy around elective populations, services, and kind of delivery models. And that is an intrinsic part of the program is that we see considerable variability, which can go to the good, and it can be challenging as we see obviously differences across the country in terms of the breadth of the coverage. So I won't say more about that now, but I think it is important to kind of remark on the fact of state interests there in tailoring the program as it is relevant locally. This is a very brief recap, and I don't want to dwell here because I think we feel a great sense of momentum and urgency around bridging the pandemic with the next phase of growth and development for Medicaid. But I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge the many things that Medicaid and its many partners got right during the PHE. I had the honor of serving as Medicaid director during most of the PHE. It was an intense and hothouse period for all of us and as a society in the country. And one of the most gratifying aspects for me and my peers really was that Medicaid performed exactly as it is intended to do. It rapidly scaled up to accommodate the countercyclic demand that occurs in dire circumstances of the kind we had with unemployment. We also saw an amazing phenomenon of active applied partnership between states and territories and the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services. They did an exemplary job of enabling mechanisms that permitted states and territories to put in place flexibilities that spanned a broad swath of preserving access, enabling the services that were newly emerging as necessary, and also just constantly thinking out of the box in terms of what states needed to do on a very rapid cycle basis. If you had asked me before the pandemic, could Medicaid programs across the country rapidly implement, for instance, telehealth, I would have had a very measured response. But in fact, that occurred in a matter of 2 months. And it's just one exemplar of what happened there. We also saw an interesting phenomenon, although obviously very tough economic circumstances for the entirety of the country. States, as you know, received an enormous amount of federal pandemic financial support, and so may kind of run counter to our idea of what was occurring at the time, but many states were able to actually make investments in Medicaid that were shoring up longstanding challenges in terms of adequacy of rates in targeted areas, and really supporting providers who had to pivot predominantly to a virtual means of supporting people. So that is definitely part of that narrative. Other aspects during the pandemic that I think were very predominant across the country for directors really was a central aspect of how best to connect with members in particular, as well as community-based entities with which they had a good standing historical trust basis, as well as advocates, how to do that in a way that was genuine and recurring and really gave the benefit of influencing policymaking at that time on a very rapid cycle. But this is an important progenitor of now where a lot of the programs are situated in building that in on a more permanent basis. We're all acutely aware of how much the pandemic illuminated longstanding disparities. They were not newly emerging. They were often underreported or understood because of constraints in data collection and analysis, and also programs not necessarily having the benefit of lived experience of people they're serving. But those were very, very laid bare during the pandemic. And you saw a lot of the reporting, particularly on testing, treatment for COVID, starting to set the standard for collection of data that could be examined according to demographic features that we have not often had the benefit of historically. A companion piece to what was emerging in the program is that we had an outflux of people from civil service that remains a tremendous problem, even as we contend with that as a larger challenge as a country, workforce issues in healthcare. We also saw a corresponding contraction in folks in civil service, as well as that piece we grappled with, and this is a very important longstanding public health challenge, but particular to kind of government interventions, that erosion of what public trust we did even have prior to the pandemic, and that continues to be a challenge for directors that weighs heavily on them. I talked just a moment ago about how the partnership with CMS has worked. It's really worth remarking on this. To give you a little bit more detail, programs during the pandemic had the benefit of meeting more than weekly with CMS, large all-call sessions that were very dynamic, filled with exchanges in the chat about arising issues, this unbelievable evolutionary curve of Q&A documents that were produced on a rolling basis, the incredibly fast pace of the disaster authorities. All of that was so much needed during the pandemic, but it also has carried forward in our current norms for the program. And this is an amazing thing that has developed with, again, recurring weekly meetings that every single program in the country is participating in, and that bidirectional communication. We are privileged to be an intermediary there, often with CMS, but it's really a tremendous process improvement that has activated the premise of the federal, state, and territory partnership. I know one of the most important interests of folks who are involved in advancing the evidence base and illuminating experience with the Medicaid program is really to be cued to what is a short list of priorities that are stratifying highest for directors. I will be careful to say that we'd be very interested in being more bidirectional about that ongoing and intentional. As I said at the outset, really like to think about how we engender kind of standing connections, as has been the case for the states that have been successful in creating Medicaid university partnerships. Massachusetts, of course, is a marquee example. The relationship between Hilltop and its Medicaid program. OSHU has been a tremendous example, really, of that kind of dynamic process of not only what's originating within the program, but what can researchers who are at more of an arm's length and looking at patterns and influences and data that can be reflected. So I'll just say unqualifiedly, we're really interested in talking through that and doing more of it. But right now, from the perspective of the Medicaid directors, this is the set of interests that are most compelling and most broadly the center of focus across the country. First, and without any equal, it is behavioral health, not only around integration of medical and behavioral health services, but the aspect of adequacy of services across the continuum, and a particularly stark need that is currently underserved is crisis and other supports for young children and youth and their families, and thinking about that on a family systems basis. So that is very, very predominant shortlist concern, not only around further investment, but also kind of resolving longstanding kind of gaps and stalls in the continuum, particularly around discharge delay in hospital for children who would be more effectively served in community settings. A very commonly held shortlist interest also is health-related social need investments. There is a range of approaches across the country, and I'm going to say more about how that is actually manifesting. But this has really taken root, and we now have a cohort that is very significant among states. It is no longer just the kind of vanguard few coastal states that are pursuing these things, really looking to move forward with a recognition of the admittedly still evolving evidence base, but the early indicators, particularly around housing supports, and the urgency of intervening where there are gaps that can produce unintended consequences. For instance, loss of continuity of healthcare of people leaving carceral settings. So again, I'll say more. Elimination of disparities is an absolute shared interest and of great urgency to all states and territories. I will be careful to say the language in which this is discussed across the country varies considerably, as does the rationales for approaching disparities. And I think we are doing a lot on our end, really to be conscious of the kind of broad landscape of how we can be most effective in each and every state in approaching this very, very urgent matter of disparities. The kind of two marquee examples are maternal health, and then access to preventative medical and behavioral health services where it's offered, dental services, but also kind of management of chronic conditions. We're very influenced by all the research that is showing from a longevity and lifespan standpoint of how important it is to be more activist on the management of chronic conditions. I talked about workforce shortages. Those are really top of mind for directors and hard to resolve. There's a lot of work going on, I know, with pipelines and subsidies, and really examining how to engender public support for people entering those professions. And this is a larger issue for our healthcare system. But there is a corresponding need on the kind of public government positions that we're wrestling with for sure. Eligibility, really two aspects. One is the unwinding of the continuous coverage requirement that ensured that everyone who became eligible for the program during the pandemic could retain that coverage, but also the more permanent aspects of how we support continuity of coverage, smooth access to the program, and preservation of services and supports. And I'll talk about some of those strategies. And finally, as we are at this juncture point where states had this enormous bubble of new federal pandemic assistance, both in the form of enhanced federal Medicaid match, but also less boundaried support like the provider relief funds and other funds that flowed down to the states. As we have seen that sunset and the sort of long tail of use of those funds beginning to ebb, as well as kind of substantial uncertainties starting to arise again for states, although there's a mixed perspective across the country, I think some risk aversion. There is concern about maintenance of many of those kind of shoring up investments that were made in rates, as well as the investment of capital that's needed to kind of get momentum with care delivery and value-based payment reforms. So more on that in the presentation also. A companion to the policy and operational and programmatic priorities is, as I started to say a moment ago, that attention and practice of engagement with people served by the program, that focus on lived experience, not merely reflective, but establishing means that can engender policy making. So really looking at kind of intercepting and reordering the way member experience figures in how the program is operated on a day-to-day basis. As you may be aware, I think that was what was more historically typical is a very structured process that was focused on Medicaid advisory committees, member advisory committees, and also a highly scripted public comment process where policy would substantially be fully formed before it was out for comment. And again, opaque and not that available to the general membership of Medicaid. I do want to just acknowledge I'm so excited about the kind of convergence of folks who are talking about this, doing applied research across the country. And just one fantastic example is Dr. Michener's racial equity and policy framework. This has got so many wonderful elements, just underscoring the practice of this, but then also providing this highly practical kind of how-to aspect of embedding the feedback loop with people, the primacy of that through kind of each stage of policymaking and implementation. I'd also like to call out the Public Policy Lab and SCAN Foundation for experiential research they're doing now on the experience of older Americans age 65 plus, really to kind of illuminate how they've engaged with the healthcare system, and Medicaid is definitely featuring prominently in those interviews. So again, that color and the kind of breadth of detail that can be illuminated there is really important, and rolling that up in the way of illustrating themes for programs is much needed. Just invoking the longstanding, still thrilling mantra of the disability community. We at NEMD really are trying to subscribe to the premise of nothing about us without us. We've been trying to do a lot of work in advancing the practice of embedding member perspective and self-direction in our events and our writings. I think moving from the perspective of, kind of moderating that experience or channeling it through advocates to really looking to people who are acting as advocates and experts in the program who also participate, stewarding things on their own. So one example was our last fall meeting. We had an amazing panel of young adult advocates. And these are the core messages that they talked about, kind of strong positive regard for the program, but again, feeling like there were some major missed opportunities there. One was for kind of connective tissue, knitting the range of services and supports together that make it really possible to take a whole person perspective, and particularly the intersection of medical and behavioral health care really seemed like there was a lot of fall down points. The eligibility process remains very hard for people to grasp. It's complex, it's multifaceted. Interestingly and compellingly, none of our panelists or their peers were familiar with the term unwinding, which is of course our shorthand for this entire process of of redetermining eligibility across the country. So we really took that very seriously. An important bellwether is that folks were not aware of the breadth of their Medicaid services. And I know this will not come to as a surprise to people on this session, but one of the most compelling examples was they did not know they had non-emergency medical transportation, a major kind of access mechanism. And unsurprisingly, they said, the ways you're communicating Medicaid programs through program bulletins and these more sort of stale traditional means are not compelling. Why aren't you on TikTok? Why aren't you looking to people who are able to advise you in terms of where are their trusted sources of information? So I just want to make sure to mention these things because these are very, very important concerns for us, trying to think through that as we kind of move forward into this new phase of development for Medicaid after the pandemic. I'm going to touch very quickly on these things. From a standpoint of models, Medicaid is principally provided through capitated managed care models. I do want to say there is some changeability there. One example is that pharmacy, a lot of states have kind of carved out and self-managed, recognizing that intermediaries haven't always optimized outcomes. There may be additional costs that have been associated with that. So that's a work in progress. There is a lot of interest in reviewing the performance of the managed care organizations, kind of all facets of their management of the program, for instance, the utilization management, and the outcomes, both from a cost standpoint of quality and also cost. So that I know is a live discussion nationally. The health-related social needs, really a big area of focus. And then health equity strategies. I did link here to a wonderful Center for Healthcare Strategies resource that capsules some very exciting work across states and territories, really from the eligibility end to the service array, the kind of breadth of who can provide services, and tools and supports to engender cultural competence, among others. So if you have not seen that, I think it's a great resource. Medicaid is very predominant part of our U.S. Spending, particularly for long-term services and supports. It is the bulwark of that spending and influence, and really the payer of behavioral health services, including SED services. So I think that's really probably a little bit under the radar of most people publicly. If you have not tracked to another excellent resource, the National Association of State Budget Officers, they do the State Expenditure Report, has a wealth of detail in the Medicaid section, kind of on aggregate spend. You see here the proportion of the program that's subsidized from a federal standpoint, the kind of overall trend as it figures in state budgets, 29.6% of total state funding on the average across the country. Also very significant swath of the federal funding that is being received by states. I do want to touch here also on the Kaiser Family Foundation annual Medicaid budget survey. For any who are not tracking this, it is full of really useful detail. When you express interest in kind of what are the priorities for Medicaid directors, it does an amazing job of capsuling that, really of the minute, probably the most kind of current capsule of programs across the country. There is a significant section in that report, and also in a standalone piece that they have issued on kind of the uncertainties at the state level around the sunset of the pandemic resources, but also decline in tax revenues that states are seeing, as well as kind of what's going to go on with our economy, even though obviously the inflation factor is a little bit less serious than might have been forecast even last summer. It's important to be aware of this because the crucial issue of investment of resources in Medicaid strongly relies on those kind of economic conditions at the state level. From an enrollment standpoint, you know this story. We had actually been seeing some modest declines in enrollment since the sort of height of the ACA implementation. But during the pandemic, we saw a tremendous uptick related to the need for the program. We are in a right-sizing period, this bridging year where we are obligated across the country. Every program is responsible to resume historically typical renewal processes please renew the eligibility of each and every person served by the program. And that has resulted in contraction of the program from its high as of June of 2023. The CBO and many other national entities have released estimates of what we will see at the end of the unwinding period. I want to say I think that is still a very dynamic process, and I'm going to share a few of the reasons for which that's the case. This slide really kind of just talks about our worldview at NEMD about the stages of unwinding. So I won't go through the slide in detail, but we are substantially through the kind of first implementation and course correction. We are still a work in progress in the sort of staging of this effort across the country, with some states fully complete, but others really only at the midpoint at most of the unwinding. So that is a kind of key message to be reflecting on ongoing. I will say without qualification, states and territories, all of us at NEMD are absolutely with everyone who is an advocate for the program on shared priorities. So I note a number of them here: overall retention of all eligible people, improved administrative processes for Medicaid eligibility, the kind of smooth transitions to the marketplace, and overall continuity of care. We're very compelled, as are you, about the need for continuity supporting better health outcomes. I will say, from a cautionary note standpoint, we are somewhat concerned about the very explicable interest in kind of extrapolating from early stage efforts. Of course, we are not in the first blush of the unwinding period, but because of the variability of the pace and the timing of unwinding across the country, I just say we really urge caution around forecasting ahead to what the early experience means, especially because many states did stage eligibility reviews based on their knowledge of kind of behind the scenes adjudication of eligibility during the pandemic. Also, I know there's been a lot of very necessary and appropriate coverage of people's loss of coverage due to procedural termination, but that's a complicated story that really involves a number of different scenarios, one of which is that people have not responded because they've either transitioned to other coverage or know they are no longer eligible. So I don't want to gloss over the reality that we have a lot of work to do in re-engagement with people who remain eligible. That's a complicated picture also. And then I think the third thing, a very obvious piece, is we really urge everyone to keep focused on the fact that Medicaid is open on a rolling basis. So in the worst case scenario in which an eligible person does lose coverage, we can welcome them onto the program again at any juncture point. In terms of the experience to date, we absolutely agree the coverage losses are top of mind for every single director. There's a lot of plumbing of that data, adjustments, course corrections from a standpoint of engagement strategies, and also systems improvement. But we also feel like it's very important to be identifying not only who is retained on the program, and then also what's happening with reinstatement. This link here is to a great state health and value strategies piece that was put out around state tracking of reinstatement through restoration, the reconsideration process. And that's emerging as a more prevalent phenomenon that states are really examining that very closely. Probably the most important thing I could say to you today about unwinding is that while more than half states will be done by June, the remainder will take much longer than originally anticipated. So this is a less linear period that is not going to be bounded by the originally forecast 12 months. It could very well extend into 2025. And I will just cue you that in the near future, CMS will be issuing updated projections around the timing for states. And again, that rolling door aspect of Medicaid, we are just trying our best to make sure, no matter what the circumstances, that eligible people can come back on as needed. We are very focused on unwinding strategies, but I think everyone acknowledges the need for permanency of changes that can obviate the need for this kind of restoration, this churning effect that we all want to make sure to improve. One of the most important strategies is the enhancement of the rates through which states are conducting ex parte or automatic renewals. We are seeing a lot of increase across the country, and that is a very, very important area of focus. Also, as you are aware, effective January 1st of this year, states and territories are obligated to observe continuous eligibility for children in Medicaid and CHIP. And several states have been at the vanguard of extending that continuous eligibility for children from birth to 6. So there's a lot of examination of kind of how to intercept loss of coverage. And another important story is the uptake of the opportunity under federal law to elect to extend postpartum coverage from the historically typical 60 days postpartum to 12 months. And this is 47 as of January, and we know many other states are in the pipeline there. So we hope to get to 100% very soon. From a standpoint of opportunities for researchers, I would say two things. One, programs are keenly interested in hearing from you, from your observations about what strategies for civic engagement and outreach, have been most effective. It's very hard to plumb that when you're kind of in the thick of the operational detail of this. But we are interested in what you know about Medicaid, but also about analogs like voter registration. Lived experience of the process, rolling that up and surfacing themes, and that sort of bi-directional communication loop is also really important. And then that identification of what we're seeing in terms of migration across the continuum. I'm very happy that we're finally getting more contemporaneous information about marketplace uptake. And I think that's going to be one of the things that we point to as a real success of this unwinding period, is routinizing not only public access to the redetermination data for Medicaid, but also bringing it alongside where people are going to marketplace. Let me shift and talk quickly. I know I'm a little bit beyond time for where I'd hoped to be, but I want to touch on just briefly on this whole area, which is very important, and that is innovation work in Medicaid. We still see states predominantly relying on 1115 research and demonstration waivers, and KFF has this wonderful waiver tracker that is a wealth of detail on the kind of range and breadth of those efforts. I will say over and above the use of kind of marquee 1115 efforts, all states are working on maternal health interventions, and you see many examples here of the service array, the approach around value-based payment, and as I said earlier, behavioral health with an emphasis on the community-based side and the predominantly focusing on children and young adults. I would be remiss if I didn't touch on the fact that even though we have an unbelievable critical mass of states that are in the pipeline with expressed intent to implement 1115s, we're having a tremendous challenge. It's almost like we've done too good work socializing this opportunity, both with Medicaid programs and advocates, but also with lawmakers at the state level. The current number of proposals, about 90, is overwhelming CS's current capacity to review those on a timely basis. And we're going to be talking about that much more publicly, but that is a big challenge administratively right now, as is the challenge that kind of following the sunset of some historical models that provided upfront capital for the seed funding for innovation. We have no kind of demonstrated vehicle like a state innovation model. And again, there's room for reasonable debate about the success of those models. But again, that kind of absence of upfront capital is significant. I'll just wind up by giving you 3 brief capsules of priority areas for partnerships around innovation that are very predominant across the country and of great interest. The first is braiding Medicaid coverage of supportive housing services with rental assistance or other housing supports. Medicaid programs are embracing the evidence base. I linked to the wonderful Commonwealth return on investment meta-analysis of research, probably that many of you have done on this call, really to talk about the fact of stabilizing someone being an incredibly important requisite for them engaging with and improving their health, particularly from a standpoint of chronic conditions. I include some material about what has inhibited this in the past, and then also what's enabling it. Kind of central means of enabling it is the federal government has squarely identified authority pathways and kind of vehicles for doing this. There's some great examples. Washington is a terrific example. Oregon, of data matching that illuminates exactly who needs this. For instance, individuals who are unstably housed or homeless, who are cycling through hospital, nursing home, and back to unstable housing circumstances, intercepting, so you know who you're investing in and the return on investment arguments around the acute spending that you're doing that can be prevented, much less improving people's lives in a very significant way. Maternal health is a tremendously urgent focus. It's a civil rights matter. There are extreme disparities that programs are interested in addressing. We have postpartum coverage, but we also have a lot of work on expanding the service array, the supports for women, and the use of bundled payments that can really kind of expand the investments beyond OBs, and as well as adjusting rates to kind of favor vaginal births. So a lot of activity there. And finally, I'll just wind up by saying that an emerging area that is very exciting and is seen embraced by quite a few states is that opportunity to recognize the almost 100% overlap of people in carceral settings with Medicaid eligibility, smoothing the path of release, continuity of care, particularly for substance use disorder that can otherwise result in, if not, continued and intercepted in disastrous consequences, including death by overdose. So very compelling arguments. We see some vanguard states have already been approved by CMS, California and Washington, but many more in the pipeline looking to kind of advance these aspects, both in prisons, but also local jails. And I think this is the emerging story of the program, is this set of opportunities. Few things for researchers on the call: supporting cross-sector data analyses. I realize the irony of saying that given the emerging difficulty of access to data at CMS, so I'm happy to talk about that as we move to discussion. But those data analyses, the opportunity to investigate near-term return on investment. I hate to be reducing this topic of improving people's lives to ROI, but that's really the transactional aspect of state budgeting that programs need help with. And then emerging areas, for instance, with school-based health, violence prevention, things that have not yet been plumbed. Let me wind up by saying, programs are really in this bridging period where we're moving to kind of the next phase of development. That is about eligibility, stability, and continuity. It's about consistent compliance with federal requirements that are designed to protect people's interests who are Medicaid members. But it is on those focus areas that data and experience illuminate have not been effectively served historically, particularly for people of color. I want to thank you so much, John, for this opportunity, and I'd love to turn it back to you.
All right. Thank you, Kate. That was really amazing, and loved hearing from you. And we've got a couple questions coming in here, but encourage others to ask some questions. And then I've got some that came in through email. But let me start with the first question from Sheldon Weisgrau, which is, I think, a really, really great question, and one that I had written down before I talked to you. And so he writes, there's a growing gap between how Medicaid operates in red and blue states. Medicaid expansion is the obvious example, but there are others: investments in administration, innovations to address social terms of health, so on. How do you see this impacting the program writ large moving forward?
I sincerely appreciate that question, and I think the observation is well taken. For me, I go back to the opportunities of not only the elective features of the program. So postpartum coverage is a great example of that, where the federal government can identify a policy opportunity, and not in the case of the postpartum coverage, but they've typically used a lever of enhanced match, and that's, I think, a powerful tool really to influence state uptake of choices like that can expand the breadth of the program from an eligibility standpoint, and or directly contribute to improvement of quality outcomes. So I think those elective choices, particularly where they're paired with the financial incentives under the FMAP, the government, no matter what administration, has increasingly used a set of tools. And I think that's an arena, no matter what the sort of ideological context state or territory is in, that's very significant. Another significant piece is kind of exploring the outer boundaries of elasticity with the 1115s. That's a principal means of enabling a state, especially a state that may want to approach things on a more incremental basis or with different rationales, different theories of social change. 1115 is a kind of seat of tailoring the program in a way that can help advance it in the context that the legislature may be in around kind of relative commitments to investments and apportionment of state funding. So I'd say those two pieces, I think, are our most powerful vehicles for advancing aims, particularly around improving quality for people and continuity of support.
Great. Well, so that's a great setup, because I got a separate question, not in the queue here, but by email about the 1115 waivers and waiver evaluations. And so we do a couple of those. We really like working with the states, but I think there's also sort of this tension between sort of what's the maximum evidence you can get out of these and what are states' priorities. And so there's been change, in the 10 years that I've been doing these, where the reports have become more standardized and CMS is sort of pushing for more robust approaches. But I think there's still, a little bit of tension between the research community, would love all the states to do randomized trials and get very clean estimates of policies and things like that. But I think states are, their primary concern is getting these federal matching funds out to as many people as possible, and so they're less interested in giving it to half, or even the feasibility of doing a staggered rollout can be challenging. So do you think that there's opportunities to find a sweeter spot there where we can get better evaluations that would really long-term benefit all of the Medicaid programs and their enrollees, versus the push to focus on touching as many enrollees in your state and not worrying so much about the quality of the research design or what you really get out of the evaluation?
It's an absolutely wonderful question. And I first want to say, I think the first thing we can do is resolve this pipeline issue around 1115s, make it more timely and expedient, simpler to get approval, because that process right now is so long and so freighted with kind of subparts in the approval that states, I think, have become by necessity, very much influenced into making the proposal as sort of clean and streamlined as possible, and as simple. And that probably argues against, more of the factors in the research that you're talking about. So I'd say that that's a piece. I'd say for me, and this is experiential for me, having been a director, another thing that I think is very material is those supplement type relationships, the state university Medicaid partnerships, engendering that on a standing basis. And that is not only kind of the function of it, but is the culture of partnership that understands kind of the piece and the mode of conveying research funding findings for policymakers. Having that kind of continuous cycle and that set of expectation. I want to just acknowledge Julie Robeson, Dr. Julie Robeson at the UConn Center on Aging. For years was our principal investigator on Money Follows the Person. She was so cued to what we need that if we had to do an 1115, there would have been already a standing orientation to how to work together. We would have had shared interests and would have been able to probably embrace more of that rigor that you're talking about. So I'd say that is another piece. I'd love to keep seeing that amplify across the country.
Great. Yeah. So, and I think you touched on that. There's a couple questions here about how researchers can connect with state programs, but I think you've touched on that. I want to sort of, people can go back and look at the slides. I think that the presentation will be shared, but I just want to sort of repeat sort of what you said were opportunities for researchers and ask a couple of questions about this. And then enrollment, you had 3 bullets. And so one was advising Medicaid programs on best practice and civic engagement strategies. And so I think, there's a variety of researchers out there who've done different studies to understand, what really brings people out. Second was to collect and roll up themes of members' lived experiences, the processes. And then the third is to eliminate experience and data around migration among sources, so Medicaid, marketplace, employer-based insurance. So I think those are pretty clear. On the innovation side, there's a lot of things going on here, and some of these are new for people in terms of how we think about measuring them. Your first recommendation was to routinize the cross-sector data analysis, and I think that we've seen some of that. And you mentioned Washington and Oregon have done that. I've seen that in some other states, and those are good for single state studies. The other 2 that you mentioned, I wonder if you could sort of elaborate on these a bit, because these again sometimes sort of are good for stretching researchers. But the first is to contribute to analyses of near term, and you said biennial budget cycles, return on investment for HRSN investments, and researchers work on their own timeline, and so maybe we need to be more sensitive to what the states need. And the other is to illustrate new opportunities for HRSN investments. And you mentioned school-based health services or violence prevention, and that's new to me. I know some of the HRSN things that have been approved, but I guess I wasn't aware that there might be some of these other possibilities. So would you mind sort of, if you're going to help researchers understand where they can shine their light, what those might look like?
Thank you for that question. So on the first piece, there's this relentless cycle when you're in leadership positions in Medicaid, where you typically, as you all know, you have a biennial budget cycle. There's a tremendous kind of advance on ramp for cultivating interest and attention by your budget office and the governor in terms of what can be shortlisted for recommendations to the legislature about new investments. So that aspect of being able to stage those rationales and to do it kind of early in the process is just a necessity. I think the other aspect is keeping in mind that 2 years is the practical boundary for being able to argue that investment of new state resources is going to yield in some important way. Most often, the lens is focused on cost savings, and historically that has been very sort of localized to Medicaid savings. What I think is modestly emerging across the country is kind of elevating from that kind of siloing of the state budgeting process to enable some kind of cross-disciplinary analyses. And in the example of Medicaid and housing, really examining, how in Tennessee and transition services covered under Medicaid can obviate acute spending that could otherwise capitalize rental vouchers. It's that type of argument that you want to be making. And that hasn't been as typical, kind of crossing that divide. But it is exactly what, and I just wanted to point to Oregon as a sterling example of this, the data repository and the kind of cross-disciplinary analyses that show what are influencing factors for different outcomes, translating that into potential for cost savings in that 2-year period. And in some states, it's a 1-year period, which is just kind of tremendously difficult, I know. But thinking about that, even while acknowledging that many of these investments are going to have much longer tail. So for instance, your housing investments, that could offset acute hospitalizations and nursing home placements. But we also know stable housing is likely going to contribute to better management of chronic conditions. And we're going to see long-term results with that. But that's not going to be as compelling to legislatures in that kind of very, very closed cycle of the budget.
Yeah, that's great. And that sort of reminds me of some of those themes that our last speaker was Chima Dumale, and I think he worked with Connecticut to run some of those and showed some of those results. That's great.
Yep.
So, okay, so I've got time here. There's 2 more questions I want to, I've got one of my own, but I want to ask this one from Joel Ferber here. He says, can you talk about any opportunities or initiatives for family caregiving, especially for children with complex medical conditions, to help alleviate the difficulty in finding and building capacity for private duty nursing services?
I am deeply sympathetic on this topic. First, I want to say that I think it is an enormous problem that families face across coverages. So private health insurance does not support families adequately. We often see the phenomenon of families having exhausted coverage and or face barriers to coverage of private duty nursing that upends the family unit, necessitates one parent leaving the workforce, creates tremendously challenging circumstances. And people wash up on the shores of Medicaid and discover that if a state, even if a state is offering home and community-based supports that can address private duty nursing, whether that is through CHIP in the limited instances in which that's the case, or 1915C home and community-based waivers, they tend to be years-long wait lists. So there is a resourcing issue that I think all of us are grappling with that predominantly goes back to appropriations and investments in that vehicle of the 1915C waivers, the Katie Beckett in particular. And so I want to acknowledge there is not an obvious solution to that in terms of amplifying those waivers in the near term to help as many people who need it. But I guess I'll just go to the fact, and again, how to do this in a Congress that is very divided and is not necessarily acting to prioritize these types of Medicaid statutory issues. A fulcrum point really is examining that central premise in Medicaid that you're entitled to institutional care and not to home and community-based care. If we were to reverse that presumption and really target those resources, I think it would be a different proposition entirely. And I am not any better situated than any of you to know exactly how we advance that in this climate, but that's really where I go ultimately as the solution.
Great, thanks. Okay, so last question. We're almost here, so we'll just the lightning round. But there was an announcement on Monday. Most of you are probably aware of this around the way that CMS provides access to Medicaid data. The National Medicaid TAF data, was just the announcement of that was November 2019. So most people are just sort of getting their heads around this and really feeling like they've got some traction. The announcement from CMS would restrict researchers from having physical access and have to work through a virtual system, which has, I think, a lot of concerns or problems that we don't have time to get into, but they include expense, kind of the speed of the data, would really slow down the ability to do work on this group. And so, I think the research committee is really concerned about this, and I think they'd love to hear from, your perspective, what your take is on, do you want these data to be out there? Do you want, were you excited to see the research on TAF going? Do you have thoughts about what this might look like? What's your perspective as somebody who's looking at the state's concerns, but also thinking about where researchers land?
Yeah, I mean, in a word, I would say it's very dismaying. It's been so, I was saying to you in preparation of this call, it's been historically so challenging for researchers to work with Medicaid programs because of factors which I think we've all grappled through in terms of reasonable basis of privacy interests and, those things that we can work through, as well as kind of the data use agreement by data use agreement approach, except in the wonderful circumstances of an Oregon or a Washington that has this really fully integrated data repository. But at the national level, our view was we were moving towards more transparency and blue sky, more ease of use. We are certainly in favor of that. There's tremendous utility in terms of greater accessibility. It only inures to the benefit of state and territory programs. And I hope we can be of support with this. I am just coming up in my literacy of what's happening. So again, I hope we can remain talking about it.
Yeah, great. Thanks so much, Kate. Well, I really appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedule to talk to the researchers, and I know that everybody in the community was excited to hear from you. Thanks everybody for joining us today. Sorry we ran a little bit over. You'll be receiving a 2-question survey about this session to help us continue to make the program better. And our next session is April 10th, and we have Julie Donahue, who is at the University of Pittsburgh and leader of the Medicaid Outcomes Distributed Network. She's a great speaker and has a great program there. RSVPs are open now for that, so make sure to stop by and join the Mike community at the series website. It's MedicaidInsightsColloquium.com. And thank you so much, Kate, and for our audience.